Hello and welcome. My name is Carolina Kaufman. I'm the Director of Education and Engagement at the Penncrest Museums. We're delighted to welcome you. It's our exhibition spotlight program, Travel Through Time in Mammal Hall. We're delighted to welcome you, and this is a companion program to our current exhibit, Then and Now, 175 Years at the Penncrest at the Old Capitol Museum, honoring the university's landmark anniversary and examining through multiple lenses the evolution and significance of the Penncrest, the heart of the University of Iowa and Iowa City. Serving to strengthen the vital role of both museums in educational research engagement missions of the university, the Penncrest Museums enhance the campus-wide focus on cultural and environmental diversity. I'm excited to have with me here today our presenters, and we're excited to introduce you to Liz Crooks. Liz has served as the director for the University of Iowa Penncrest Museum since 2018 and holds an MA in Museum Studies and graduate certificates in book arts. Born and raised right here in Iowa City, Liz developed a passion for museums while visiting museums that she now oversees. She serves on numerous campus advisory committees, including the Museum Certificate Studies program. I'm also excited to have Cindy Opitz. Cindy is the Director of Research Collections at the University of Iowa's Museum of Natural History and Old Capitol Museum and oversees the curation, preservation, digitization, and management of over 130,000 zoological specimens and cultural objects. One of her greatest joys is to teach museum object preservation in the UI Museum Studies Certificate Program and takes time to mentor collection interns and volunteers. That said, though this exhibition and exhibition program as we commemorate its history of our university and the land that it sits upon, it's important to reflect and remember with gratitude and respect what this land has meant to people over the course of human history and in society long before the university and museums were present today, and which many have come before us, many indigenous nations of people that have lived, fought for, and continue to thrive on the land of what we know as the land of the state of Iowa. As you see here today and throughout the Midwest, consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experiences of Native peoples will help inform the work we do collectively as a university to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment, and retention, efforts that acknowledging our past, present, and future Native nations. I myself am a proud member of the Native American Council here, which supports Native American students and faculty at the university. To learn more, we'll provide some information in the chat. This exhibit and exhibition program we are presenting you today has been made possible through the hard work of staff for the Penncrest Museums, and I would be remiss if I didn't extend our gratitude to the Office of the Provost, who makes all the museum's work and exhibit possible. And now to our program. One of the things that what strikes me as being very interesting is the history and the evolution that this land has seen. Of course, we acknowledge the people that have lived on this land, but we acknowledge the ecological history that it comes from. And this map, which is fascinating, shows that evolution. As you can see, we're looking at sort of what was the last ice age in this area of the Midwest, and of course, it specifically shows Iowa as we know it today. But it also begs us to think about how we interpret the land and the world around us, and how we understand it for both educational interpretation and engagement. And this is a very engaging image of Iowa. As you can see, we see both evidence of human and mammals that were present at the time of the last ice age. So I think it's a really interesting image. That actually image comes out of the Office of the State Archaeologist. And in addition to that, we want to today explore some unique questions that will help us understand better of how the museums, and in particular, our focus on Mammal Hall, has evolved and changed. So how have our museums evolved and matched societal changes? This is a question that we're going to explore. And in addition to that, we're going to explore how this evolution has changed things that regarding collecting and our collections, the exhibits that are in our Mammal Hall galleries, and the student involvement. And again, I should reiterate, this is a 115-year history that we have, and we've been very lucky to have as the second oldest museum west of the Mississippi. So I'm excited to change it over to Liz Crooks, who will help embark on this journey. Liz, take it away. Liz, I think you need to just unmute yourself.
I do need to unmute. It's as if I've never used Zoom before. Thank you, Carolina, and I am very excited to have our guests here with us. I'm a little humbled. I see that there are some folks on the call who have much more experience and in-depth and up-close experience with the exhibits than I do, but I'm happy to share from my perspective what makes Mammal Hall such a special place and how it reflects the changing attitudes in particularly natural history museums. So in order to do that, let's go back to the very beginning. Museums of natural history often trace their origins to a phenomenon known as the Cabinet of Curiosities. Growing out of the Age of Enlightenment, there was this great desire, particularly by the upper class of society, to better understand the environment around them, to start exploring in a more scientific and organized way their natural surroundings. They would do this by collecting, and they collected everything, and they displayed everything. You can see in this etching how rooms were filled with all of these objects that for most people at the time were curiosities because they represented collections from often remote and then exotic places. So let's move on to the next slide. You can see here at the 150th anniversary of the Museum of Natural History, we put together an exhibit, a cabinet case called the Cabinet of Curiosities, and it is still in place outside Iowa Hall, the south entrance to Iowa Hall, and it is our representation of all of these different objects that have been pulled from our collections and exhibited as they may have been at that time. In the era of the Cabinets of Curiosity. And I think this is an exhibit that was put together by Cindy, wasn't it?
I might have had a hand in that.
In pulling all of those things together. So, and we really can't talk about the Museum of Natural History or McBride Hall without talking about Charles Nuttig. And let's move on to Charles Nuttig. Charles Nuttig, people often have this contest. If you could invite 5 people to a dinner party, who would those 5 people be? Maybe at or very near the top of my list would be C.C. Nutting. For over 30 years, Nutting directed and participated in a series of expeditions that collected specimens from all over the world. His particular approach to science was based on taxonomical research. He would order animals in their taxonomical order, and at the time, that was how scientific study of specimens was organized. He also realized, though, that there was great value in sharing these objects and sharing his expedition stories with the public audience. He was really quite shrewd in that realization at that time. He understood very quickly that being dependent on state money meant that he was dependent on support from the audience, the constituents that supported that. And he also realized that there was an obligation as an instructor and as a part of the university to give back and educate and share some of the research that he was doing with the public. And so he did that in a couple of ways. One was through lectures, the other was through exhibition Also, he was the driving force that built then the Hall of Natural Sciences, as we see the header on this slide. Later, it was renamed McBride Hall, of course, but originally known as the Hall of Natural Sciences. He brought the scientific approach to the museum. Let's go on to the next slide. So here are some pictures from that expeditionary period, and it shows us how he was able to balance both his expeditions, his research, and the public display. You can see, even though the slide is a little dark, you can see very clearly there are a lot of things crammed into those spaces. And so part of that was there wasn't a whole lot of space, but part of that was also the custom of the day. That's how things were exhibited. And let's go, speaking of collecting, let's move on to the next slide. And I'll let Cindy talk about this.
Yeah, so we have a lot of collections here at the Museum of Natural History and Old Capitol Museum, as Carolina referenced. Over 130,000 specimens and cultural objects that are my responsibility to preserve for future generations. So as mentioned, originally collections came from university expeditions. They were displayed in taxonomic order, as you see in this photo. There's an array of birds, and I think in that center part of the image, those might be invertebrates from marine expeditions. The emphasis was on the classification of species and science education. And these expeditions were worldwide in nature. They went, Nutting led students to the Bahamas and Latin America, the far north, up north of Alaska and Canada, also to Fiji and New Zealand, all over the world. And these expeditions brought material back to Iowa, which were then available for study by students at the university. And as Liz mentioned, also played an important part in engaging the public with what the museum was doing at the time.
Cindy, I have to say that I'm fascinated with the cases that are in there. Those cases are things you don't see today as much, but I have seen those types of cases at the Harvard Peabody Museum of Natural History. It's a very old form of showing things, I believe, but I don't see those types. Is that true? Is that something that's just an era looking case for observation?
Yeah, I think that as we'll explore in our section on exhibitions, our method of displaying material has changed, as has the purpose or the goals that we have in displaying those collections. If I'm not mistaken, I think there are folks here from OSA. I think they might still have some of these old cases that we gave to them. Maybe not. We'll see.
The other thing is that you have to remember how folks were using these collections. If you were in a university class and you were studying invertebrates, these look like maybe mollusks, maybe not, maybe they're other, but they look like bivalves of some sort. So if that's what you were studying, it would be very beneficial for you to be able to get as close to those objects as possible and to be able to examine them from multiple angles. And that's another thing that these cases allow. That really, for me, this slide illustrates perfectly the focus on taxonomy, scientific classification. It also, for me, really sums up the role of manifest destiny, the idea of manifest destiny, that the American people and their institutions, museums were one of those institutions, held these special virtues. And it was our responsibility to both redeem and remake the West and the Western world in the image of the agrarian and primarily Anglican East. So it's very interesting for me to think about how this idea that was prevalent at the time shaped the way that so much of the things that happened in the museum shaped how they took place. And as a student both of museums and museum history, that's one of the most fascinating pieces for me. It was almost like there was this irresistible drive to get out there and get as many things as we can and bring it all back and share it. And that's not, I don't think, specific to museums, certainly, or even museums in the United States. There was this great era of expedition and collecting that was happening during that time.
Yeah, and it was also happening in the context of colonialism. I think it's fair to say that Charles Nutting was a scientist and was interested in educating the students and the public, and that was his primary motivation for bringing material from all over the world back to Iowa. But there were plenty of collectors who went out with the sort of goal of conquering the peoples and the habitats that they encountered.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see some remnants of that today in our collections, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Let's go to the next slide.
So this shows how we store things now. And you might have noticed that now we're looking at one of our storage areas and not something that's on public display. The museum is no longer actively collecting. We do not have researchers going out into the field around the planet, bringing material back to study. Objects come to us mainly as donations or as orphan collections. And an orphan collection is a collection that might be at another institution, which no longer has the desire or ability to continue taking care of that. So they offer it up to other museums to take those collections in, because that material is priceless and should not just be discarded because no one at another institution is no longer studying those things. So yeah, museums don't display everything they have anymore. There's just too much material, and our approach now, as we'll see in the exhibitions segment, is more targeted. Most museums display less than 10% of their holdings, and in some cases, some really large museums, that's only 1 or 2% of what they have, and the rest are research collections that are stored behind the scenes. So as I said, we're looking at one of our collection storage areas. We got National Science Foundation funding for these fancy cabinets, and I love them. Every time I open one of these cabinet doors, it's like Christmas 2015 all over again, because that's when they were installed. And inside these cabinets, you see drawers like the one at the left. These are birds in our research collections, and each of those birds has a tag, and that data associated with the bird that's recorded on that tag, and then also in a database that we have also behind the scenes, is valuable to researchers. Our collections are still used in classrooms, and classrooms also come to us. Instructors bring their classes to use our galleries for inspiration and also for instruction. We get classes in the sciences, the arts, writing, history, engineering, anthropology, all kinds of classes. Oh, and also museum studies.
How far back do the collections go, Cindy?
How far back? Well, the
Yeah,
museum, the museum's origins are, I think it was established shortly after the university was established. I'd have to look up the specific date, but it was back in the 1850s.
Do we have objects that are that old? And
We
why
do.
would we, I guess I'm asking you a leading question. What is so special about, I know what is so special. I would like you, from the research collection standpoint, to share what is so special about having a historic collection like this.
Well, yeah, so the material is very valuable in that each of these specimens, for example, in the image on the left, are basically little time machines. They take us back to a specific place and point in time, and they can tell us all about what was happening in this species through genetic studies, what was happening in the environment through isotopic studies. And these time machines can be compared with current species and are useful in biogeography studies, comparisons of what was here way back when and what is here now, what happens when populations merge because of climate change and shifting geographies of the natural world.
The question, or what I really wanted to blurt out was tell the time machine story, because for me, that is, people often ask why. Why do you do this? Why do you have these things? Why do you have these exhibits? You know, what is the purpose? Why do we need this kind of space and this kind of special equipment to house these collections? And it blows my mind every single time I recall the fact that the people who collected these specimens had no idea about DNA, had no idea, couldn't even imagine how we would be using these specimens, some of them 130 years later. It's just amazing to me. And similarly, it's our responsibility to conserve and protect and care for them, because we can't imagine how they could be used in another 130 years. And that's very exciting to me. That's one of the reasons I get out of bed every morning. So, well, enough about that. Let's keep going.
So yes, go ahead.
Well, so we have here a very stark example. Attitudes over time have changed the way that collecting happens. Cindy talks about the fact that the majority of the objects we receive now come through us either through donation or by absorbing smaller collections. That was not the case during the expeditionary period. We see here an image of Frank Russell, who was a graduate student in the 1890s at the University of Iowa. And for 2 years, Frank Russell was sent off to explore the Arctic and collect things. He spent 2 years there interacting with the native peoples, collecting specimens, collecting ethnographic objects. And again, for me, it's an example of this manifest destiny. We're going to go, we're going to collect, we're going to find all of these things and bring them back so that we can study them. Conversely, we have a student, and as the changing social values crept in, more of a trend toward environmental consciousness, protecting and caring for, preserving our environment, our species. So has collecting changed. Here we have an image on the right of a student, an undergraduate student at the time, Ryan Adams, who took a kayak float down the Iowa River, and his research that he was performing was to collect water samples and impact the areas in which he traveled through as little as possible. And so for me, these two stand in stark contrast. They both had similar missions to go explore their natural world, but they went about it in very different ways.
Yeah, so Frank Russell, his expedition was 1892 to 1894, and there were rumors circulating that maybe there weren't very many musk oxen anymore. So the Board of Regents approved his expedition to go get some while he still could. So that's just one example of the earlier views on collecting. This gave rise, of course, to the early conservation movement, because people began to understand, well, if we're all going out and grabbing these things, then there won't be any things out in our natural world left for others to see and study and enjoy. So there was a recognition that we needed to curb collecting. Another thing that Russell did was he interacted with Native peoples that he met in the regions that he was exploring, and employed some of them as guides, accompanied them on a muskoxen hunt, and he would interact with them during the day and hear their stories and record their stories. But at night, he would go and dig up some of the graves that were mentioned in those stories and take some of that material. And so now the idea of repatriation and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 identifies that human remains, funerary and sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony belong with the peoples from which they came. And even before that Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, otherwise known as NAGPRA, even before that was enacted, former museum director here, George Schrimper, understood that it was not right that the Museum of Natural History should hold human remains that were a result of Frank Russell's expedition. So he sent them back to Canada and worked with the government and tribes there.
There were folks in Iowa who were instrumental in starting the move toward what ended up being the NAGPRA and that act. And so I feel very proud that the Museum of Natural History was an early adopter through George's insight of returning sacred objects to their peoples. And so through his foresight, we have avoided many controversies about objects in our collection. And we also have a well-documented practice when we do come across objects on that rare occasion that remain in our collections of how to work with our partners to return those to the proper peoples.
I should mention that our partners, of course, include the Office of the State Archaeologist, and we're so glad to hear that they're present today. Later on, I'll mention a future exhibition program which highlights their work. So we'll be excited to hear more about this topic with them.
Yes, they're the experts. So I'll be happy to hear from them. But this is these two expeditions, for me, in a nutshell, really capture the changing societal attitudes about collections. And it's a really high overview. Cindy and I have been known to talk an entire afternoon about just this subject. So what's next?
Oh, I think I started to touch on this earlier, that our collections are used in different ways now. Before, the emphasis was on scientific classification and taxonomy of specimens, looking specifically at how things looked, at the morphology of things, the physical characteristics, and how specimens within one species differed from each other, and then how specimens from one species to another are different. And this was before DNA technology. Now we have DNA technology, and genetics play an important role in research. So there are still people looking at how things differ within species and from one species to another. But also, as I mentioned before, the data about where something was collected and when it was collected is also very important. And we've been working hard in the collections department to digitize our collections, which means imaging sometimes, but more importantly, recording the data in an electronic format of, the who, what, when, and where things were collected, and then sharing that with the world through global data aggregators. So, for example, our data is out there, and we can see that there are millions of downloads of data from our collections each year. And that's exciting to know that people are looking at our data, comparing our old historic specimens to current research that's going on in the field to look at those shifts in biogeography, in population. Every once in a while, I'll get a request to send either specimens or just toe samples from a bird or a mammal in particular species for people to do DNA analysis and to look at what was happening then versus now.
And I got a little bit ahead. This would have been a better place for Cindy to tell the time machine story, but I get so excited about it. I couldn't wait. So everything that she shared with you here, harkens back to that idea that our specimens are a time machine to a different time and place. The exhibits. This might be a good time to mention, we've had a question, where were things displayed before there was McBride Hall and the Museum of Natural History as we know it today? And that's a really good question. The original Cabinet of Natural History, as it was known, was founded in 1858, actually in a corner of the old Capitol, because that was our university building, the singular at that time. We can't see my finger. Our building at that point. It was founded in, we believe, the northeast corner of what is we now recognize as the Senate chamber. So that's really neat. Of course, as the collections grew and more space was needed, things were moved into Science Hall. And then that became, I think, I'd have to double check this, but I think Science Hall became Calvin Hall, and it was moved across the street. Many people are familiar with the story of how it was rolled on logs a distance of 10 feet every day. Classes were still held in the building. We now know it as Calvin Hall, and it sits across the street from us. So that's where, but that building was quickly outgrown, and that's when Nutting realized he needed more space and he needed to lobby the legislature. So let's keep going and get into the, I see we're ready to talk about expeditions in a broader way. And for me, Mammal Hall really encompasses all of that time capsule of exhibits we can see present today. And that last picture hinted at that. This is a picture that clearly one of our before pictures. It shows animals arranged in taxonomic order. They're organized by scientific classification. There are bare walls. The labels have bare bones information with family, genus, and species. Nutting, though, while he was a proponent of arranging exhibits in this order, recognized the idea of museum fatigue even back in the 19-teens and addressed that one way by advocating all of the background be painted light olive in color. Its green color he felt was representative of nature and the natural environment, and as such was restful to the eye, and so it could give the visitor a break from this kind of overload. But you can get a glimpse of what it looked like then. Let's take a look at how we think about exhibits now. This, of course, is our antelope diorama, and it's a grouping of antelope in Wyoming. It hints of things like their habitat. It still gives us information about the genus and species, but there's not obvious in this picture. There's a label above it that talks about how the specimens were collected and some information about that. There's a lot more context in this diorama. There's more interpretation. We get a much greater sense of what life for those antelope may have looked like. We also get hints at the magpie in the forefront and then the prairie dog in the background. this for me, and I think also for Cindy too, is where art and science and education all intersect. This was done by Homer Dill, hired by Charles Nutting to come and teach taxidermy and plastic arts at the university. Started the first museum studies program that we'll learn more about in a bit, and also was masterful in creating, as a naturalist, masterful in creating these kinds of dioramas. Here we have another look at before and after. The same exhibit here, the same specimens shown on artificial rocks in an open display. And in the 1990s, during a major Mammal Hall renovation, the walruses were enclosed behind glass. There's a mural to represent what would have been their natural environment, and artificial snow to convey that they live in a very cold place. So, which was not always immediately apparent to the visitors before.
I think
Cindy,
it's interesting that it's, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna add, I just think it's interesting that the way they put the walruses in the middle with the railing around it, it makes me think of a zoo for some reason. But I also think like that whole light filled area, is this the same space that we see the exhibits now? Like, is this the same room, or is this a different room in a different part of the building?
It's the same space, and you can see in the older picture on the ceiling, those are skylights that let a lot of light into the room. Those have been closed up because now we understand that UV and light are not good for the long-term preservation of specimens.
That was something that Nutting also acknowledged, that natural light he felt was the best, but he recognized that there was beginning to be this school of thought that perhaps that natural light did degrade the specimens. And in fact, if you see them in person, you can see some of the resulting damage from that UV light. But he also recognized that that was best for viewing because it really, the natural light eliminated glare that was often found with electrified light. So it's interesting to read his papers and see him beginning to deal with that issue of UV damage.
Here's another example of the lions on display in the past. They're together with other cats, all together in a taxonomic classification style, bare-walled display. And for a long time, the lions were just stored in open storage with nothing around them because there was really no other place to put them. But Liz can share about what has happened since then.
So the lions, they were for a time up in the attic. That was not ideal because there was no climate control in the attic. Well, there's not a lot of climate control in Mammal Hall. It was a more stable space for them than being up in the attic of McBride. So they were brought down, put in an empty exhibit case, and remained there, as Cindy said, in open storage for decades. But during the pandemic, while we were closed to the public, we undertook a project. I like to say some people learned another language, some people cleaned out closets. We gave the lions a habitat during our closure. And let's take a look at what folks can see now. So because of their size and the size of the exhibit space, we were really limited on what we could do to physically fit them in there. So that didn't change very much. We were able to give them about an extra 12 inches of space by recovering some space of a storage area behind them. So we slightly enlarged their enclosure. We worked with public artist and muralist in the Iowa City area. Some people may be familiar with Thomas Argan. He created this beautiful backdrop based on trips to Africa that he had taken, and we were able to create a more realistic environment and add this interpretive label that talks about the lions. These particular lions, we could do a whole episode on them. We call them affectionately Harry and Josephine, after Harry Brummer, a downtown Iowa City businessman who was visiting his sister in South Africa, saw lions in the zoo, and thought that the children of Iowa City should be able to see lions in their zoo. At that time in the 20s, there was a zoo in Iowa City Park. The lion enclosure was where the Shakespeare, roughly where the Shakespeare stage is now. So the lions have a long and interesting history with Iowa City and with the Museum of Natural History. So I'm very proud to be able to give them this space.
Liz, I want to add that I spoke to Thomas Argan, and he was very interesting in sharing his sort of approach to his mural work. And what I find interesting when I look at the walruses and the beautiful painting behind it, they're really trying to capture sort of their environment. Thomas revealed that one of the reasons, once he learned about the story of these lions, you know, and it was a bittersweet story, and it does deserve its own program, I agree. The storm behind that you see is a reflection of their experience. And I really found that to be very profound and something that we don't see in other exhibit dioramas in terms of the, you know, slight interpretation of the animal's perspective, if you will. But I really
Right.
thought that was a beautiful, touching thing that Thomas added to his painting deliberately in relation to the story of these lions.
Again, that, you know, reflects some of our changing societal approaches and ideas about animals in captivity. And he was able to use a natural phenomenon, this oncoming storm that is seen, you know, it's accurate to the area, but also to encompass that feeling for the lions. Right. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, in this slide, we see how dioramas can show not only a larger picture of what's going on in the habitat of where things live in the natural world, but can also show their behavior. These musk oxen are in a circle because there are wolves circling them, and this is defensive behavior. So as you can see through the displays themselves, but also through interpretation and labeling, we can tell more of the story this way than we could with animals just lined up against bare walls.
And this image, you know, an image is worth 1,000 words. This conveys immediately to the viewer that these animals are under threat in a way that would be very difficult to do in as compelling a way. Gully, the artist who painted this backdrop, I think this is one of my favorite of our dioramas because he so eloquently captured that.
Yeah, I was actually super surprised when I first saw this, when I started working here, is that there was only 3, but I always thought there was more because of the
Right.
exquisite artistry to showcase more than what's really there. But still, it was about what the habitat and the behavior.
That blending of
Yeah.
the foreground and the background so
Yeah.
that it is almost seamless.
So well done.
Right. Right. This is one of my favorite parts about working in the museum and working on a university university campus is our student involvement. And students have been involved in the museums since the inception, right? We talked already about Frank Russell, who in 1892 went on a collecting expedition. Here's another example of our period of we call it our period of exhibition. Homer Dill was really instrumental. Homer Dill, hired as a professor of taxidermy and plastic arts, later went on to be the director of the museum studies program. I'll let Cindy talk about that a little bit, but also was really instrumental in many of the dioramas that we have still today.
Yeah,
Originally, go ahead, Cindy, you talk about it.
Yeah, the Museum Studies program began in, I think, a single class in 1907, but has been a continual program since 1910. And that makes it the longest continual program, Museum Studies program in the nation. The original focus was on exhibition. Students learned taxidermy, they learned molding and casting. And in all of our dioramas, you can see student work from the taxidermy animals to the wax leaves in the dioramas. The students were involved in all aspects of exhibition.
So here we see the moose diorama being installed in 1828. It was the subject of an article, Training Museum Workers. So even then recognized for its role in training museum professionals. Let's see what it looks like today.
I cheated a little bit and went there by mistake, but
That's okay.
hopefully people didn't get a chance to look until now.
That's okay. It's just the same, except now Cindy's there, which is
Yeah.
wonderful. Do you want to share your moose story, Cindy?
My moose story. So yeah,
touching.
when I was in high school, you know, high school can be a turbulent time, and I would go buy a chocolate eclair from Barbara's Bake Shop and go and just sit with this moose family. I felt like it was really peaceful, and it got me away from life and all of my troubles. And so yeah, I reenacted that event by sitting here for a photo.
So
That's a beautiful
I love
story.
that, though. The lifelong impact that these exhibits have is really I think an important part of what we do. But thinking a little bit more about the program itself, this is one of my all-time favorite pictures. We still have classes in this lab. We still use those lab tables. They look exactly the same. We see here Homer Dill overseeing a class in the Museum Studies program. I like the representation of both men and women. There were quite a few women who, as students, were involved in the program. And my favorite, the zebra in the background, who's now on exhibit in Mammal Hall. Do you want to talk about what it's like to work in that same space, Cindy? You spend more time there than I do.
I do. We can move on to the next slide too. Nope, we skipped one.
So sorry. Where did
Oh,
it go?
oh.
Forgive me as I look for that image. It was in there.
It was in there. I'm looking at it on my screen. So anyway, in the image that I have on my screen, I am teaching a class just a couple of years ago in that very same space. And I love to sit at those same tables where the students 100 years ago were working on their projects.
You can stop and share so you can see it.
What?
Do you want to share your
Sharing,
screen,
so
Cindy?
you can just quickly share your screen. Don't put it in full screen, but just share your screen with the image so we can at least see that. That would be great. You should
It just says that you disabled participant screen sharing.
Here we go. We'll get that going. There you go. Go for it. Wait, people, yeah, we want people to see what you do today in those spaces and that furniture.
I'll make it bigger.
Oh yeah. So just yeah, just make it bigger and then that way we can see it.
There, so can you all see that? Yeah.
Perfect.
That's me with a class of museum studies students. The current program is a museum studies certificate program, and students from all kinds of backgrounds and majors, from history to art history, communications, anthropology, all kinds of students from across campus can add the museum studies certificate to their course of undergraduate studies. So yeah, you can see here the same tables that are in that historic picture. And I love to just be part of that legacy of museum studies instruction on campus.
It's really amazing to me as I've been on campus a long time, and I've been in a lot of different spaces on campus. And for the museums to be in the space that was originally constructed to house our offices, our laboratories, it's amazing to me. And it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to exist in the same spaces and have the same office that Charles Nutting had. It's, if I think about it enough, I get a little bit choked up about everything that that means, but it's really special. And we think about it every day. So
And
let's,
yes, and now the Museum Studies program has expanded to include all areas of museum work. Before it was focused on exhibition and the arts surrounding exhibition. Now it includes collection care, museum administration, education, interpretation, engagement, museum history, social justice. And as we mentioned, the students aren't just artists interested in taxidermy and making wax leaves. They are interested in all kinds of museum careers.
And many of them have gone on to do museum careers, which is really great, from directors, exhibitors, education, museum educators. So it's a proud line that we have, and one of the oldest in the country. So
I
it's
think
really
there's
great.
some alumni on the program today,
Excellent.
if I'm not mistaken.
Oh,
So
welcome.
it is wonderful to be a part of that. And we couldn't talk about museums if we didn't ask the typical museum question that we always get after every big exhibit, after every big event. What's next? And, you know, that's something we think about all the time. Indeed, what is next? And for us at the museums today, we're not out there in the field. I'm not sailing to the Bahamas to collect marine invertebrates. We're not very often, rarely do we get the opportunity to install a whole new exhibit and diorama. But what we do get to exercise are the powers of engagement and how we engage the public and how we share this rich and deep history with our public, and how we share it with our local and regional communities, with global researchers, how we do this and explore new ways to make the galleries and programs and online content like this available to a broader audience. How do we increase diversity, making sure that there are more voices represented in our programs, our exhibits, engaging audiences in different ways, using our galleries in different ways. This picture is from a wonderful team building event that was done with a group of students who were in a particular class. And for them to be able to both have this informal education, you know, they're in our galleries, they're learning, they're absorbing, they don't even realize it because they think they're playing a game. That's really wonderful to me, to have that kind of playful activity happening in our spaces, and students using them and enjoying them in that way, taking that learning from a very passive approach to a more active approach, I think is an area in which we're always looking for ways to expand. Carolina has a quote from Frank Oppenheimer that I really like: "No one ever failed a museum." So, right, everyone takes away something, and everyone has the opportunity to learn, and learn at their own speed and in their own way when they're in a museum space. And that, to me, is very important, a very important part of our mission moving forward.
We're so glad to, I mean, Liz and Cindy, your stories and, you know, everything that you've put together in this has been such an eye-opening experience on, you know, what's upstairs. You know, a lot of people that come through these galleries, you know, there's a lot of wonder and there's a lot of curiosity, but it's also, you've opened the doors and insights of people that helped make decisions for these spaces and influence the way we look at it and continue. You know, like you said, this story isn't over, it's going to continue. I'm so grateful to you and Cindy, Liz and Cindy, for your time today. And there's so many more stories. So I think the best way to, I guess, move forward in terms of what's next is to learn what's next. So I put thank you ... because there's more to come. And I just want to share and allow people to ask any additional questions, where if it's okay for anybody that wants to stay a little bit longer, we'll add questions. But I'd like people to save the date, because we have the next exhibition spotlight program on October 17th. The link for that is coming soon, from 12 to 1. We're excited to bring the Office of State Archaeologists and the OSA Indian Council, who works very closely with the Office of State Archaeologists about archaeology, and it's Archaeology Month. So we're going to be excited to bring them on. Additionally, in the coming 2 months, there are 2 tree tours left. So if you have not taken a tree tour, these are free and open to the public to explore the Penncrest and the trees and the history and the lore behind it with some mindfulness and practice. So again, we are inverting our museum and looking at the arboretum that is our campus, because that's also a tree museum, actually, being an arboretum. So I'm excited to have that. Please join us for that if you haven't already. And this Friday, another way to explore the galleries and engage with us creatively with Art and Write Night, which happens once a month on the first Fridays. Thanks to our wonderful neighbors, Blick Art has provided some materials for us and for the public to use and to creatively express themselves, both in Bird and Mammal Hall. So if you liked what you see today, come visit the Lions, come see the stories, learn more, and get creative with us. It's this Friday. And we're so thankful. I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to take the screen off.
And I will put
allow
in,
people to ask.
I
Yes.
will put in a plug for the tree tours. It's been wonderful to have them this summer. We've been very fortunate with beautiful weather and to enjoy the shade of their canopies. But as we segue into fall, I'm very excited to continue them and watch our fall foliage and see how that cycle unfolds on our campus. So that will be very exciting. And I did see on the social media feed, it looked like we had an illustrious visitor to our galleries, Herky, who could not resist sketching while he was in the galleries. That's just how compelling some of these objects are, and also to use them as a different writing prompts and explore the artistic world around us through the galleries, I think is a great opportunity, and encourage everyone who hasn't yet to take the opportunity to do that. But yeah, what questions do we have?
Yes. So we have a couple questions. Okay, so someone asked, how did the Lions get to the museum? Where are they from originally?
They're from the area near, as best we know, Johannesburg, South Africa. Harry Bremer, who owned Bremer Clothing, that was a fixture downtown for many, many decades, traveled there to visit his sister, who was living in Johannesburg at the time, and somehow acquired these 2 cubs, shipped them back on a steamer across the Atlantic. I can't imagine how much meat they must have needed for that journey, considering they were young cubs when they got here, and older cubs when they young cubs when they left, older cubs when they left, how much, what that would have taken resource-wise. But then they lived for a brief time in his carriage house, which is at the end of Iowa Avenue, because their enclosure was not yet ready for them. So they lived in his carriage house and then were transferred to the zoo. The male lived in the zoo only 2.5 years. Based on newspaper accounts of the time, sounds like he had some sort of lung infection and succumbed to that. You can imagine that Iowa was not the habitat for a lion to thrive. And at that point, he was brought to the zoo, and Homer Dill did prepare and mount him. Josephine lived a few years longer, and when she died, she also was brought to the museum, and Homer prepared and mounted her, and actually published, developed and used a new taxidermy technique he was developing and published that in a scientific journal at the time. So we have a lot of documentation about that process. So that's how the lions came via Johannesburg to the City Park Zoo to the Museum of Natural History and now Mammal Hall? That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Those are actually all the questions. But I actually have a question for you guys. Maybe share with the public any upcoming exciting projects that you are working on or are excited about for the museums that lend to the conversation and to our topic of collecting exhibits and design and evolution or anything like that.
Well, for me, there was phase one, the zebra conservation that took place this past winter. We're looking forward and planning for phase two and maybe some doing some updates to the zebra. That's still pretty early in the planning process though. But that was a wonderful experience to be a part of. We have a major, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because Will has asked a question, says talk about Carl Akeley's zebra and his conservation. So you mentioned the conservation, but yes, our zebra specimen came to us from the Field Museum, where it was mounted by Carl Akeley. It was originally hunted in Africa by, I cannot remember the man's name, but once it got to the Field Museum, it was mounted by Carl Akeley, who was a very important figure in the history of taxidermy. He's known as the father of modern taxidermy, and was also an early proponent of dioramas as a display tool and an educational tool in museums.
Akeley has an entire hall of African mammals at the Museum of, not at our Museum of Natural History, at the American Museum of Natural History. So if you have the opportunity to enjoy that, it's spectacular. You can see one of Akeley's very first museum dioramas, the beavers. Yes, the beaver. No, I'm sorry, the muskrats, which is on exhibit at the Public Museum in Milwaukee. Upon entering the Public Museum in Milwaukee, you will see they also have a much larger area set up that harkens back to this idea of cabinet of curiosities, which is fascinating to look at their interpretation of it. But there is Akeley's, one of his very first museum exhibits. Akeley and Homer Dill would fill up another 2 seats at my dinner party. So you see a theme emerging there. But yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned, Liz, the Cabinet of Curiosity, and then thinking about what's next. One of the things that Cindy and I have had a wonderful privilege working on is My Collections. And for those that don't know, My Collections is a new way of thinking about collecting and thinking about interpretation, and also acknowledging that museums aren't the only ones to think about collections. Everyone can collect, and everyone does. A lot of people. It's been a wonderful journey with Cindy to select community members that collect almost anything. And we're able to exhibit their collections and they get to curate them. The submissions for that are open and always available, and just go on our website. And I welcome anybody to apply. So we're excited to soon announce our newest collectors, but currently you can see our exhibit on royal memorabilia from a physician here in Iowa City, and also some stereo viewers. You guys remember those? My Gen X friends will remember those, and maybe those before that. He has an extensive collection. Corey Kriegmer, who's a film studies professor here, sharing their collection. So just another way to think about, and actually juxtaposed from the original Cabinet of Curiosity at the museum. So please come see those as well. Okay, well, unless anybody has any other comments, I'm ready to close this session, but I'm so grateful. Thank you very much, Liz and Cindy. If you are willing to stand for a couple more minutes, we will just end the recording, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to end the session. So I'm just gonna stop recording, and thanks again.
Thank you, Carolina.